I'm Laura Mulvey, and I'm very happy to present Joanna Hogg. And we are going to start the discussion with me asking her a couple of questions to get things going. And then after... Where are we for time? Oh, it's quite late. So we'll probably talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up, general conversation, but I'll chime in if appropriate. Now, I wanted to start just by asking Joanna a little bit about your transition from television into making films. Whether you'd always loved films, whether films were important to you as a child, as a teenager, and if there was anything you especially loved that precipitated that movement. Because to make movies is difficult. You have to have some kind of driving force.
Yes, and I'm not sure if I always sort of held that driving force, but I did want to make films from quite a young age. I mean, I was very interested in cinema when I was even sort of from the age of 12 or something. But I didn't think at the age of 12 I want to make my own films. But I loved, certain films spring to mind, like Powell and Pressburger's The Red Shoes. I was, age 12, a huge fan of Frank Sinatra, slightly strangely, as well as David Cassidy, sort of very opposite. But I love musicals. So I was also, I loved Gene Kelly, so Invitation to the Dance was one of my favourite films when I was a young teenager. And then I got interested in photography, so I did photography before I went to film school. And in fact, just before film school, I already had the idea of making a feature film. Sort of ridiculous confidence that wasn't really kind of supported by anything. And that didn't happen, of course, but then I went to film school, and then rather than make these sort of big ambitious films that I love so much, these sort of big kind of musical blockbusters, I ended up going into EastEnders and Casualty. I mean, I don't know how that happened, really. Seems kind of absurd now, but I think I had it was sort of a bit of a loss of confidence at film school. And somehow I thought maybe I have to prove myself.
But was it useful in terms of training and getting used to working fast, efficiently? Is there anything you feel that you gained from it?
For a long time, I didn't think there was anything at all that I gained from it. But I realised, yes, if I have to work fast, sometimes you've got half an hour to shoot a scene or something, so I can manage that, right. Because I had to shoot a ridiculous number of minutes a day when I was doing soap operas. So I think there was some use in that, and maybe a sort of confidence in working with actors, and always different actors, and being inherited, not always doing the casting yourself, so having to work with lots of different people.
Well, our conversation this evening is called Pleasures of Making, so we might move on from what doesn't seem to be quite such a pleasurable moment in your life and think a little bit about the kinds of pleasures of making that are very, very visible in the feature films that the 3 feature films that you've made. And I thought that I've thought of a couple of topics I wanted to ask Joanna about, but I've turned it rather upside down, because generally people talk about sound last, and I think sound is very important in Joanna's movies. So I wanted to start by asking her about how she approaches sound, both in terms of synchronized recording and in terms of these very, very complicated composed soundtracks that you make.
I mean, sound is an obsession. It's really an obsession now. I think it's my favourite part of the filmmaking process, but it hasn't always been that, because having come from photography, it was obviously
but it's
from the image.
You loved musicals as a child. That sound should have come back to being an obsession and an interest, a passion.
Yes, and I suppose I think of sound as rhythm. I think of it as music. So what I was trying to do, particularly with exhibition, was create a kind of music with the soundtrack, using everyday sounds, and as you say, not all of it is planned. So a lot of that sound creating is done afterwards. I mean, I'm always careful shooting sort of nice sound at the time of the shoot, and in fact with the house in exhibition I was very concerned to capture the actual sounds of this place, so it wasn't all sort of created afterwards using other sounds. Most of the sound in the film is sort of sourced from that place.
So you mean the sound of H's chair moving around above Dee's ceiling was an actual live sound?
Yes, it wasn't Foley done afterwards trying to mimic that. It was actually recording in that space the sound of that chair on the floor.
Yeah. And then there's a way in which one thing I just wanted to mention was that you, in your two earlier films, in Unrelated and in Archipelago, there are two very, very extraordinary scenes of quarrels, family quarrels, where the dramatic quarrelling happens off scene. And then there's a slightly similar scene, which I hadn't really noticed very much now, of the crying, which you have to a blank screen. And I wondered if you could comment a bit on how these high moments of emotion that happen actually without being seen.
I mean, I mean, in each film, those ideas sort of happen. Yes, I mean, it's not a sort of idea I have in advance that I want to do sort of these arguments off screen. But I mean, with Unrelated, I remember, it's quite a long time ago now, but I remember that I did conceive that argument as happening off screen. I felt that it was more about the people who are witnessing it, and there's something more powerful hearing an argument than seeing it. Sometimes I find it sort of something alienating about seeing a sort of screaming match on screen. And I think there's something more frightening for me, and maybe it comes, thinking of childhood. I think it maybe comes from experiencing a lot as an observer and hearing my parents in the house that I grew up in, not arguing necessarily, but just hearing things at a distance. So I think there's something about the way that I experience the world, kind of slightly apart from things. So that so those ideas I think come naturally. And yeah.
Well, we can come back to sound when we talk about the house, because we'll come on to the house in a moment. There was just one thing I wanted to ask you about, because the two earlier films both happen with family holidays, and holidays obviously are transitional moments. And exhibition is dominated by the fact that this house where they've lived for 18 years is about to be sold. So it gives a kind of transitory nature. It's not like a holiday, but it's something threshold-like, liminal, something which is going to come to an end. And I wondered if that was something you'd thought about as a pattern.
I mean, I again, maybe it's sort of experience, but yes, often it's not the sort of kind of everyday life, or there's something about being taken out of it's different with exhibition, but being sort of taken out of your normal habitat and on holiday, it's supposed to be a time of relaxation, and it's so often the complete opposite. And I just sort of observe things boiling to the surface in those situations.
When everyone's trying to have fun.
Yes, and when a family is sort of having to be sort of happy, to pretend they're happy together, and maybe they're not. So there's a sort of tension there, I suppose. But it's interesting you say that about exhibition also having that sort of period of transition. I suppose I didn't sort of conceive it like that, but it was just something that I was interested in depicting. It was sort of again down to sort of experiencing myself a sort of a feeling of I was thinking, actually, when I made Exhibition, about moving out of the place that I was living in. I hadn't actually done it. And now, actually, since making the film, I have actually moved house, and it's far more traumatic than I realised it would be. Much. I mean, if I made the film now, I think I don't know, there would be a lot more tears, I think, maybe. But yes, there's something about, I think often the stories I tell come about because of a sort of obsession or a sort of something preoccupying me at the time that I'm making it. So, and that gives me the sort of impetus to make the film. There's something.
But I think we should talk about the house, because the characters are obviously really important, but we can leave them on one side for the time being. And I wondered if you could say something about James Melvin, who the film is dedicated to, and I presume is the architect.
He designed and built the house for himself and his wife, which I think is stated in the film, actually. But he was an architect mostly of commercial buildings. He designed the annex of Sheffield University was one project, a building in Marylebone Road. I mean, they were tended to be sort of commercial office buildings, but kind of modernist in style. And his architectural practice, Colin Melvin's ward, was began in the late 40s, and then I think they're still going now, actually. But he died in 2011. But I didn't get to know him until the early 90s, and through knowing him, I got to know the house.
I see. So that was, again, was a personal encounter and a personal interest.
Yes. So it wasn't just simply finding a house or a location and wanting to film there. It was really, the whole story that I wrote really was built around this particular house. And at one stage, it seemed like it might be quite hard to actually film there. And I thought, well, if I couldn't film in that particular house, then the film wouldn't exist.
But they say very specifically in the dialogue that the couple have lived there very happily for their lives. But at the same time, the house struck me as it's inhabited by D and H, as having something uncanny about it. And this is, I think, to do with the soundtrack, but also to do with the way you shot there's a way in which the usual protective division between inside and outside dissolves in your camera through all these extraordinary effects of reflection and so on. But I just wanted to ask you about the uncanniness and whether there's anything, whether I'm right at all about that, whether there's a sense of a kind of something living, the house kind of having a presence of its own.
Well, it was definitely something that I wanted to create. I don't know how it sort of came across to everybody here, but I had been observing in the spaces that I've been living in myself how a house or a flat can change character. It can. I mean, I feel that the house in Exhibition isn't always it doesn't always give off that feeling of uncanniness, but there are times that I wanted it to feel quite unwelcoming to Dee, and other times where the house is very loving and sort of enveloping her, and so through sound
and the moments when she cuddles it, as it were.
Yes, but then moments where she's frightened in it, so it can be threatening as well.
And that time when she's left alone.
Yes,
and has to check all the cupboards, lock the doors.
Yes, just. Yeah.
And then there are always these strange sounds coming either from inside or from outside, and the way that it's not only the reflections that bring the outside into the inside space, but there are constantly sounds, dogs barking, cars hooting, scaffolding dropping, which also makes this kind of penetration of the outside into the inside.
I mean, that was something that really struck me about the house. That when you were inside it, it was very sort of a lot of sounds from outside penetrated. Sort of you'd be standing in the house and feel that the car door that you heard shutting was, or someone shouting, it was actually coming from inside the house. I think maybe there's all the glass plays tricks on your ears. So I wanted to sort of convey that inside out sense that I mean, it was just there. It wasn't an idea I had. It was just if you kind of stood in the house and listened and observed, it had all these characteristics.
And it was obviously the same with the reflections and the translucence and this dissolving, as I said, of the protective barrier at certain times.
At certain times, exactly. Sort of very, yes. I mean, I think anywhere that has big glass windows, you reflects a lot. So it just seemed very. I quite liked it. Felt sort of quite surreal. The sort of idea of seeing a tree, sort of suspended inside the house, and sort of vice versa. Just the sort of the sort of inside outside. And
just to carry on for a moment with my uncanniness theme, I've noticed in your other films, and very much in this film, that there are shots of trees, plants, leaves waving in the wind, which also it seems to me to go back to that sense of the animate, how the wind is a spirit which brings things alive. Which relates to a certain extent to the way that the cinema itself kind of brings alive the inanimate. And I wondered what these interludes meant, whether they're just beautiful, which they are, whether they're also giving a sense of somebody's being disturbed. Anyway, where do they come from?
I mean, I tend to experience weather as, I mean, if it sometimes, I mean, it sounds sort of mad in a way, but I mean, if it's very windy sometimes, I have the thought that there's something changing. I think I'm sort of quite superstitious in a way. So there's something about weather and sort of what's going on kind of emotionally in one's life, or what sort of, I don't know, somehow it's sort of psychology of weather or something. I don't know. I find it very, I find it quite powerful. So it's definitely not about beauty. I think it is about sort of reflecting, which sometimes I think can be too obvious in a film, and maybe in my own films, but yes, reflecting something that's going on in the story, and also I do love nature, so I think it's naturally going to come into my films. And even as you pointed out earlier, even in exhibition which takes place in London, in a city, there's still nature in the city. And I think
Kensington Gardens is just across the road.
Yes,
clearly.
yes. But also the house itself is a sort of, as well as sometimes being frightening, it's also an oasis, and it is surrounded by this sort of quite exotic foliage, which is sort of very London in a way.
Yes. But I think, this is just a comment of mine, but I think it relates in some way, your interest in the weather relates to a kind of Englishness that you get in your films. The English are supposed to be interested in the weather, and I really like that, about the way that the weather comes in, and it's part of your observation of social milieu of various kinds, and the weather is part of it. Yeah. But I think we should move on, because we have to open it up. There were a couple of things I wanted to ask you first. Because we're in the context of onward and outward, I wanted to ask you about being a woman director, whether it irritates you to be called a woman director, as it irritates many women directors who say, don't say that. But very often they say, don't call me a woman director, but then their films are about things that are actually very, very close to women's topics. I mean, I'm thinking of Chantal Akerman in some sense, and I should have mentioned at the beginning, sorry, I kept thinking, I should have mentioned that Joanna is part of a Cine Club collective called À Nos Amours, and they've been doing this wonderful retrospective of Chantal Akerman here in the cinema for quite some time. And there are moments when I feel that there's a kind of Akerman-esque sensibility in your movies, but I might be imposing that on you. But anyway, I only brought Akerman up because I know she doesn't like being called a woman director. certainly doesn't like being called a feminist director, but her films are very much to do with topics that are close to women's hearts. Anyway, I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I don't think I have the same irritation. There may have been the odd moment when I have had that feeling in the past, but when we were talking about that earlier, I thought my reaction now, because it can sort of change, obviously, but right now I think I'm inspired by it in a way, because I'm inspired by the idea of doing something new, doing something different, and I think as a woman, as a female filmmaker, there's a long way to go. So that sort of inspires me, the idea of sort of challenging myself, and I am interested in, I guess, a kind of female experience, and I'm particularly interested in that right now because I'm writing a film that's very much about a female point of view. I don't think all my films have necessarily been that, maybe Exhibition, but this one I'm writing now sort of even more so. So I'm kind of going very deeply into that subject, so I can't really say I'm sort of irritated by that idea, because my subject at the moment is that, and I'm interested in it.
And I think it takes us back to the title, Pleasure of Creating, that there is that sense of trying to touch unknown territories and trying to think how to articulate what hasn't been said before, what might have been felt but not necessarily said or put in so many words in front of people to think about.
Yes.
And
yes.
that just brings me to my very last point. In an interview, I found Joanna quoting from Bresson, who said, "Let feelings create events." And I've somehow, that pointed out very vividly how important feelings and emotions are running through your movies, and as though they are, it is the emotions that in a sense come first, and the events that emerge out of them. And there seemed to be something in the spirit of melodrama about this, and which fits in again with your interest in music and sound, melos, music, drama. And I just wondered, before we open it up, are there any comments you would have on that?
I suppose, yeah, the reason I like that quote is that I'm sort of not interested in imposing a story or sort of creating a plot, and I suppose what that suggests is that the story comes very naturally from something sort of quite deep often. But I wanted to just mention, because I was really struck by I hadn't seen Margaret Tate's film before that we saw at the beginning, yeah. And having said that I'm interested, just going back to that earlier point about being a woman filmmaker and wanting to do new things, I was really struck by what she did in that film was really what I wanted to do with Exhibition. And I didn't, obviously. I think I made something different, but I began with the desire to do something as sort of raw as that in a way, because she was talking about exactly what I was interested in, and I'm not sure
in fact,
if I.
It's a very good bit of programming when one comes to think about it. Whoever programmed, congratulations. Because there is also the sense of the inside and the outside, and the work and trying to work, and even the workman outside in the street. It
was quite strange, having not seen it before, how many connections there were, in fact. And in fact, Adam Roberts, who I do Arnaud Zamor with, is in the audience, and he said, as we were coming out of the Margaret Tate film, he said, well, it would be interesting if Exhibition had been shot on 16mm, and Place of Work was shot on digital Alexa, which is what we shot. How the films, if you just did that's what would happen. But I would have liked to have made my film 16mm. I think it's just so,
Oh, well, I'm very glad you brought that up, because after seeing Exhibition, which is such a very powerful experience, I'd more or less forgotten about those connections. But I think you're quite right. They're very vivid. And now I wondered if anyone has anything they'd like to ask Joanna. Do we have microphones? We do. Please, someone come up with something. Someone there. Wait for a moment for the microphones.
Thank you. Marvellous programming, great juxtaposition of the two films. I'm from Leicester, sadly, and Phoenix is one of the partners, the venue partners, that's taking onward and outward as part of the Outside London. Two sort of part question. How do you see the programme impacting cinema and film goers beyond London? And secondly, I'm running a course. It's a 4-week course called Where Are the Girls? And it looks at the future of filmmaking in terms of women filmmakers. Wondered whether you had any comments on either of those two topics.
Sorry, where are you based?
Phoenix Cinema in Leicester.
I mean, yes, it's difficult to answer the first part because I haven't seen, shamefully, maybe, the rest of the Onwards and Outwards programme, so I couldn't really talk about it in a general way. But I think I didn't realise until this evening that it was being taken outside London. I think it's a really, I think it's a great idea. And actually, Adam and I are always very interested in. Yes, one's just got to think, obviously, beyond London. And I haven't, as I say, I haven't seen the rest of the programme. I've seen some of the films that are being shown, but it can only, I mean, it can only be a good thing, obviously.
And in terms of the future of filmmakers, women filmmakers, so it's called Where Are the Girls? It's about young people eventually. And we will look historically at women filmmakers, right from Lottie Reniger all the way through. But yeah, interested to know, you spoke about being a woman and a filmmaker, and how do young girls, where do you see the future of filmmaking from a female perspective going?
That's hard to answer. I mean, I hope there will be more female filmmakers, obviously, and I, you know, just from my own journey, I know that it's not always easy, and you know, I lack confidence along the way. I mean, interesting to hear, Laura, what you think about that.
I suppose what I would say is that events like this make it seem possible for women to make films, which otherwise you might think there were just one or two who managed occasionally to make something. But at least with Onward and Outward, you get a sense of consistency, and that there's an actual build-up of work. It's contemporary, and it seems as though it could be a real inspiration, I think, to young women. Also, I think another thing, just to come back to Joanna for a moment, is that she's pointed out in interviews that making Unrelated was comparatively cheap. Is that true?
Yes, very cheap.
And one of the important new factors now is that young women, anyone, should be encouraged to work with digital cameras and their own imagination. And I feel that these films should inspire not only that possibility, but also, as Joanna was saying earlier, to think about women's topics. What's relevant to them? What's relevant now?
Thank you.
Anything else?
And I think actually that the stumbling block for me early on was that I did think I would need a lot of money to make my first film. So I planned to make a film. It's just too ambitious, and I think that caused me to. I mean, it just took me a lot longer. It's only when I realised that I could make something in a cheap way that it actually happened. I mean, just for a long time, I thought I need a big budget. I want to, you know, I want to create something big, and that was, yeah.
So then, that's another lesson: is start small. Yeah.
Stay small, maybe.
We have two down here.
Hello, thank you for making your films. I like them a lot. I just have a question. I haven't seen your first film, so sorry. I will. But in the second two, no, I do want to. But in the second two, I was just wondering, because your characters are quite well off, that I wondered if that contributes to like a theme that I see in the films of a kind of insulation that can sometimes make life feel quite threatening for them. I don't know if I've just completely made that up. But I mean, even in exhibitions, they live in their beautiful house, but it seems like the world is sort of out the window in a way that sometimes is quite disconcerting. And I don't know if that is something that you think about. End of question.
I mean, it's something that comes up. I think about it more in these situations than I do actually when I'm writing the films. I mean, it's and maybe I should think about it more when I'm writing them. But that's not my particular interest. And in fact, particularly with this film, it's not what it's about for me. It's about two people, maybe quite isolated, but it's not. Yes, it's not necessarily a financial thing, but it's it obviously that's what comes across to people, but that's not the essence of what I'm looking for.
Hello. I was wondering, your film seems like it's progressing from, like it's from young to older, where you have an unrelated. It kind of seems like it's in the teenage area, and it gets a bit more to people around my age, and exhibition is more the middle-aged, and we are talking about a married couple, and so I also think that it's a progression of sexuality. So I would like to hear what you were thinking about that, because in exhibition especially, it kind of popped out from the others because there was such focus on Dee's sexuality, I think. So I would like to hear what you thought about that, and why you were thinking about doing that as opposed to the others.
Well, it's true. I was aware, particularly when I made Archipelago, that I hadn't dealt with sexuality, sort of at all, really, in that film. I mean, in a very sort of oblique way, maybe, and that was something that was sort of often there's something left over from a previous film that I haven't, the sort of unfinished business somehow. So I carry that unfinished business into the subsequent film, and that unfinished business after Archipelago was very much having not dealt with sexuality at all, and having wanted to with the Edward character in Archipelago, if anyone's seen it, and so that and yes, not having really. Well, with Unrelated, I felt that I had dealt with sort of female sexuality, but I wanted to do it in a more straightforward, sort of head-on way in exhibition, and so that's what I tried. That's what I tried to do. I mean, in terms of the sort of age progression, I don't think that's something I'm really thinking about. I mean, the film that I'm working on now is about a young woman, aged 20. So I'm sort of going backwards and forwards in terms of age. I'm not particularly interested in one stage of life, so it's but yes, with exhibition it was very much sort of middle-aged characters, I suppose, and maybe as I get older the characters will kind of follow me, but right now they're sort of going backwards. So it's, yeah.
Thank you.
Is that someone at the back there?
Hi, were you at all interested in playing with the kind of audience's knowledge of your actors' sort of real life personas?
No. No. I think I'm just interested in the actors or the non-actors in sort of bringing something of themselves to the character they're playing, but not to make any direct connection with their real lives.
Are there any follow-up points to that about the difference between working with professionals and non-professionals?
Yes, I mean there's a big difference. I'm constantly working out whether, sort of which side I want to go, or how to sort of combine actors and non-actors, and inevitably there's sometimes some pressure to have actors. I mean, in terms of people coming to see the films, but I'm really fascinated working with non-actors. Sometimes the downside of that, I think, is in the non-actor understanding, or rather pushing the character that you've created kind of further than you've sort of. It's hard to describe, but I suppose sometimes I think the tools of an actor are really great and really useful, and sometimes frustrating when the non-actor doesn't have those abilities to transform themselves. On the other hand, a non-actor can be incredibly surprising and undemanding in a way. I think often actors want to know sort of about their character. They want to know
who am I?
Who am I? Where do I come from? What kind of experiences I've had? And I don't find that personally interesting. So the non-actor is kind of delightfully innocent in that sense, and will often just take the person they're portraying kind of from the sort of present moment. They're able to be in the present moment sometimes more easily, I think.
I think there was someone at the back, and it'll have to be the last question because we're coming to the end of the session.
I wrote it down so I wouldn't stumble too much on it. But it was sort of around the idea that there are, perhaps not with a more limited cinematic.
Oh, we've lost you. Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
It seems to me with I guess what this makes me aware of as quite a limited cinematic education, that there's a big space between kind of the more films that are so sort of tightly emoted and preemptively emoted for you in kind of more mainstream cinema, and a film like this which kind of has such sort of sensuous and sort of daring play with silence and with space. And I wonder, I suppose you said originally you started off in much more tightly scripted sort of casualty and these firmer narratives, and I wondered just what were your stepping stones, kind of letting go of that control to something like this?
I think it wasn't just a sudden sort of going from one to the other, because I'd been at film school before I made the television, and then before film school had made short films and been wanting to make films for a long time, and not the sort of films not that connected with the television work. So the television work was the kind of exception to the rule rather than the other way around. So fortunately, even though I did, I don't know, about 12 years, I think, of television, I hadn't lost the sort of essence of kind of what I was interested in. And if anything, because I had been deprived of it for all those years, I was sort of even stronger in me that I knew that I wanted to do something very different to what I was currently doing in television. So it just sort of all came back to me. I think I realise now, because I'm sort of travelling backwards in the work that I'm doing right now, I'm just realising how little I've changed in some ways as a person and as a filmmaker. And a lot of the ideas that I was jotting down when I was in my 20s, those ideas, or the sort of dynamics around those ideas, aren't so different now. I think it's surprising how maybe a little we change. We like to think we change, but.
Well, I suppose it's just there's so much there, and it takes time for the various things that are there, the ideas that are there, to find a way into scripts and films and so on. So it just takes time.
Yes.
But I think now we'll just have to thank Joanna very much, and